to the Liberation Hour, here with Comrade Felicity, your last name redacted, but you could probably look it up anyway. Hello, it is the Liberation Hour, it is a Wednesday, it is 7 p.m., so here we are, here at WRFU 104.5, Radio Free Urbana. It is the top of the hour, and so we must do the disclaimer. Alright, let's get it done. WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign online community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU UCIMC. Okay, let's get started, comrades. We have a lot to cover today. We have an awesome interview, which I will be playing for you all. This with one Professor Grover Furr, who does not academically specialize in Soviet history and Stalin-era history, but it is a lifelong passion project for him. He is, by trade, a medieval literature academic and has spent many, many years studying such things, and many, many years studying Stalin, the Man of Steel. And so, on the second half of today's show, I will be playing the first 24 minutes of that interview, and you can find the rest of it on YouTube when this episode releases. So stay tuned for that, keep a lookout, and let's get started! Alright, first things first, the climate update. You may be wondering, dun dun dun, what has happened? What has happened in the climate update? Well, it's not great. It's not terrible. It's not great. First and foremost, we have the Texas AI data centers. Now, I know that many of us have probably been hearing a lot about the data centers and how much water they're using and how much energy they're using and how terrible they are for the environment, and that is what I'm going to talk about right now. According to the Economic Times, amid the ongoing worsening drought condition in Texas, the state's residents face an unexpected water dilemma. While communities are urged to conserve every drop, even cutting back on simple showers, massive new AI data centers are quietly using millions of gallons daily to keep their operations running, as per a report. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack with just that. And this isn't even half of it. So according to the Economic Times again, behind this high-tech promise lies a growing environmental concern, and that high-tech promise being AI. Water consumption. According to July 2025, an investigation by the Austin Chronicle, data centers across central Texas, including Microsoft and U.S. Army Corps facilities in San Antonio, used a combined, get ready, drumroll please, 463 million gallons of water in 2023 and 2024 alone. As reported by Techie Plus Gamers, I should just say and, but I'm going to say plus because it says it. That's enough water to meet the needs of tens of thousands of households, according to this report. Okay, let's break it down real quick. So, I think I'm just kind of speechless, honestly, that this is even allowed to happen. But, I mean, we can't be surprised when corporations are literally allowed to, like, run the world. Hello. So, the first thing that I think about when it comes to these data centers, especially in Texas and how much water they're using up, is the fact that this is not a sustainable program. And anything that you hear, honestly, about how AI is going to improve our lives, how it is going to bring new tech solutions to modern day problems is just a bold-faced lie. I mean, I think that AI as a technology, I think any technology could be or may be useful, but when we look at the material consumption and we look at how much, like what exactly does it require for these AI data centers to go and run, and we can obviously see that it is quite a lot, like millions, literally millions of gallons of water. And all I really have to say to that is it really serving the public if all of that water is instead of going to people who are literally living through a drought? Is it really that good for the American public that millions of gallons of their water is instead of being, used for, I don't know, watering crops, hydrating people, just the basic things that you would need water for, the fact that it's in a drought no less, being used for AI data centers, which, let's be real, the working people who are, whether they, I don't exactly honestly know how these data centers even function, but we know for a fact that the people who may or may not be employed by these data centers are not getting paid a fair wage, that the people who are ultimately profiting off of this are billionaires who do not care about the environment at all. They have made that very clear. Back in the 50s, oil companies knew that climate change was going to be exacerbated and made a huge problem should they continue to do business as usual. And what did they do, folks? A business as usual. Thank you. Yes, like that is what they did. This is no different. We know for a fact that these AI data centers, not only is AI being used for frankly stupid crap, and I cannot swear on air, but if I could, you know what I would be saying right now. It's not actually, I see AI and technology like this being used, it can in fact be used for public good, but it's not. It was never a public good. And if anything, AI is being used more as a way to, for example, I'm a university student, as a way for students to be able to amass all of this information to, for example, do your homework better. But the problem is that, first of all, AI is not always, what's the word? I'm blanking now. Basically, AI is not actually always correct. And in fact, it actually has a liberal bias. AI is only as smart as those who program it, and is only as smart as what it's fed. Meaning that when it's being fed all of this internet content, as we saw with things like Grok, for example, on Twitter, we can see that Grok basically became, as it said this itself, Mecha Hitler, which I don't know why more of us aren't like, so freaked out about that. Because what do you mean you're Mecha Hitler? What? So when I look at stories like this of Texas AI data centers and data centers across the country using up valuable natural resources that can be used to improve society for everyone, being used to basically line the pockets of billionaires who are using AI as yet another scheme to make as much money as possible rather than actually serving the public, we can see that this is just one of the many ways in which this industry is being used to hurt more and more people. There are ways in which we can develop technology to both serve public good and to also not destroy our planet. And corporations do not care about that. They don't care about either of those things. They care about the bottom line, which is profit. And this kind of brings me into my next climate update, which is the Environmental Protection Agency on Thursday, this is according to Inside Climate, published a rule extending deadlines for the oil and natural gas industry to limit emissions of methane and other harmful pollutants. I quote from the Inside Climate again. In an emailed statement, a representative for the EPA said that the move, which was signed on Monday, and this article is from July 31st, represented an important step in unleashing the nation's domestic energy supply by extending several unworkable compliance deadlines in the Biden-Harris administration's Clean Air Act rules. Okay, I'm just going to cut through the crap here. This is not that. If they wanted to, here, ladies, if he wanted to, he would. And in this case, if they wanted to, they would. If they wanted to, they would have already limited to, if they cared enough to force these oil and gas companies to do anything, they would have already put these limits on years ago. This has been a problem for years. Climate activists have been talking about this for years. By extending these deadlines, they are only showing their hand even more. They do not care. Point blank. I've heard people say, oh, well, if, Biden and Harris, they do believe in climate change. It doesn't matter, actually. It doesn't. Because they are in the pockets of the same billionaires that the Republicans are in too. They are uniparty at this point. There is no difference here. Here's the thing. You put a bow on a pig, and it's still a pig. it's just it's like the whole lipstick on a pig thing, you know? Just because the liberals say it the way you want it doesn't mean that they're actually going to do that. And frankly, when it comes to the EPA extending this, and obviously this is under the Trump administration, but either way, they this is, once again, the government does not care about actually limiting emissions of methane and other harmful pollutants to from, like, they don't care if oil and gas companies are doing that, and they never really have. The truth is that, once again, liberals and conservatives alike, everyone's a liberal at this point, but we've gotten to a point now where it's hard to say or discern between the two, because, again, this has been happening under both Republican and Democratic administrations. When it comes to the climate change, when it comes to protecting us from companies, oil and gas companies that want to drill, baby, drill, that just want that sweet, sweet earth juice. If there's a profit to be made, understand this: it's not going to change the outcome. The liberals might tell you, hey, we care so much about the environment, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that they comply. And frankly, that's just not true, and this is a great example of the fact that even with something like the Clean Air Act, it simply doesn't matter, because the damage at this point has already been done. Okay, so my last quote from for the EPA environmental protection stuff is basically this, from, once again, Inside Climate. Delaying implementation will simply give a handout to the worst actors who would be able to continue their polluting ways with zero consequences or accountability to neighboring communities. And this kind of sums up my position perfectly here, which is that there is absolutely no accountability, because the people who they are supposed to be quote unquote accountable to, they don't care. They don't care, because guess who's probably funding their campaigns? These industries. These industries fund either side, because to them, there's no difference between the two. They both want to work for capitalism, and capitalism really doesn't care. Unlike what Ben Shapiro says, capitalism doesn't care about your feelings, and so, and I hate Ben Shapiro. So, understand this, that it doesn't matter who's in the White House, it doesn't matter what administration is there, this will continue to happen. Handouts and will continue to be given to billionaires who, quite frankly, have never deserved it. And this kind of brings me to my next big thing I want to talk about today, which is the ICE raids in Kansas City. Federal agents from KCUR reporting federal agents conducted immigration raids at 2 Mexican restaurants in the Kansas City metro area on Wednesday, detaining up to 12 workers. The coordinated raids by Homeland Security investigation agents took place at both locations of El Toro Local Mexican Bar and Grill at 11 a.m., according to the local group advocates for immigration rights and reconciliation. The advocacy group said in a press release that 7 workers were detained at 1706 Village West Parkway in Kansas City, Kansas, and 4 to 5 workers were taken into custody at the 188 Woodland Road location in Lenexa. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a second. So, first things first. I have footage of this on my, I was sent footage of this, and I have to say, not only is it completely horrific, but it is also, when you actually see it happening in broad daylight, people are going into these, ICE agents are going into these restaurants and detaining people just left and right. It really puts it in perspective, I think, and I really urge more people to go out there and advocate for your community. When you see with your own 2 eyes what is actually happening, I think it makes it so much more pressing, rather than just seeing it on the news, actually being out there with your community, trying to support people through kidnappings like this from ICE, which, yes, it is a kidnapping. This is not legal. When we actually have to face the music, and in this case, it's the ICE raids. In the case on a global scale, it would be the genocides that are happening and the famines that are happening in the Gaza Strip and Sudan, respectively. I really urge people to actually engage. Don't shut yourself off because it's hard to look at. I know that that is a really easy thing to do. It kind of temporarily releases a sort of pain of, okay, at least I don't have to look at it anymore. But that doesn't mean it's not happening. And here's the thing about being an engaged community member, being an engaged villager. I'm going to refrain from doing the Minecraft sound. I'm refraining. Okay, continue. When it comes to being in a village, you also have to be a villager. You can't just say, oh, it takes a village, and then shut yourself away from your community. This is the time, more than any, to get out there and do advocacy and be there for your neighbors. And for families and people that are suffering and struggling from this ridiculous policy and, quite frankly, fascist policy. If you know people, who know people, give support however you can. Put yourself out there, because when we talk about communities who have come together to fight for the greater good and to fight against fascism and oppression and all of the things that are happening today, we're talking largely about communities who have been forced to stick together because they are all they have. We are all we have. Understand this. I know that we've all been really accustomed to living in a system in which it's totally warranted and fine to have this kind of like rabid individualism where, well, I don't owe anyone anything. What do I owe you? And I've heard this. I'm actually, little disclosure here, I'm actually an elderly caregiver as one of my jobs. That's what I do as my full-time job. And I would say something that I've heard a lot from, and I'm gonna say boomers, is, well, what do I owe people? I don't owe anything. All I owe you is a good handshake and respect. And it's like, okay, first of all, that is a completely ahistoric way of looking at how humans have, first of all, developed, but also how humans and how people and how societies have made actually any change. We've kind of been I would say, not like brainwashed, but really indoctrinated into this idea that the way change is made, the only way change can be made, is through specific systems in which you just follow the rules and you put all of the gadgets where the gizmos go and you turn all the right knobs and then you get the right result. That's actually not how that works. Community change and change within not only communities but at large starts with mass mobilization. This could be mass mobilization like through protesting out in the streets. This could be mass mobilization through doing community workshops and mutual aid events. This could be mobilizing online, creating networks of care online in which you create connections and communities with people to give support that way. I mean, there are so many different ways in which you can build community, and it's the fact of the matter is that when we talk about something like the male loneliness epidemic, it's not because you're a man. Okay, you just don't have community like the rest of us, because we have all been told that the only way you're ever gonna that the way to make it is to step on everyone else and to only get yours, because screw everyone else. That's what we've been told. That's just not true. When it comes to like a male loneliness epidemic or loneliness epidemic, and when we look at ICE raids and people being ripped out of their homes and ripped away from their families, this is a lack of community. And I don't want to say that the ICE raids are happening because of lack of community. The ICE raids are happening because of fascism. And the community responses are community mobilization. And when you look at how people, for example, Kansas City Tenants Union is a great example of this, how they have created a community within tenants who all have something in common, first, but who have all been mass mobilized to not only fight for each other, but show up. Just showing up. I don't want any more of this nonchalant business. I am chalant, okay? I'm here for the people. I'm here to do community work. I'm not out here being all mysterious and dark. I'm literally so vocal. And this whole I know I sound like a crazy person, but there's been this whole like internet culture and also like kind of weird subculture in Gen Z, and like I would kind of say millennials probably too, of like the best way to show that you are like a desirable person is to just be so like laid back and reserved and like you don't even care. And it's like, okay, but under fascism, like why would you do that? Why would you do that? And when your neighbors are being ripped out of their homes, you know, just for the crime of, let's be real, being brown, because that's what this is about at the end of the day, are you going to sit there and be like, "Oh man, that sucks." No, you should probably go out there and like, I'm not going to say to do violence against anyone. Don't do violence. But you should go out there and advocate for your neighbor and support them and see if they need anything and connect with other people to help maybe make bond or bail for them. Um, you know, finding ways that you can support these people, because guess what? I'm not going to do that one poem about the Nazis and like, you know, first they came for blah blah blah. But yeah, like truly, if you really want to see that from see it from this perspective, let's just say it. Like, you need support, because when everyone else is gone, because the fascists have come after everyone, and you just and not just you, but and people chose not to care, what happens? We have seen what happens. And so we should not at any cost allow us to give up our community solidarity in an effort to basically join what the capitalists have sold us as a fulfilling life. Because I'm sorry, but when we let go of our community bonds, when we see our family members and our friends and our neighbors and the people around us as disposable rather than human beings who not only deserve love and respect but also deserve to be in community, it really changes our whole outlook. And so the next thing I would like to discuss is a let's take a look. Trans woman in Texas was assaulted. Reporting from the news, them. They're just them. I think this is a queer news media outlet, and they said them said a transgender woman and several friends were harassed and assaulted in Austin, Texas last weekend, and one bystander who stepped in to defend them was hospitalized in an incident police are investigating as a possible hate crime. Spoiler alert, it is just a hate crime. There's no possible here, it's just a hate crime. The three men then reportedly began shoving members of... Oh, wait, no. I think I may... Okay. On July 26th, the trans woman who requested anonymity during the ongoing investigation and several friends visited Barton Springs, a public swimming hole in Austin Ziegler Park, as Cron reported on Wednesday. During their visit, three men they didn't know flirted heavily with members of the group, the woman told Cron, but soon began harassing and pointing at her, making remarks about not supporting that lifestyle, aka they were just being super transphobic. The three men then reportedly began shoving members of the group and poking the women near their breasts, according to a Reddit user who posted about the incident on Monday, claiming to be a friend of one of the victims. At that point, a bystander identified as Jared. Hello, Jared. If you're listening to this, you're a hero. Intervened and was attacked himself. The three men proceeded to get violent and aggressive, yelling at us and getting in our faces until one of them decided to start swinging and punched Jared in the jaw, knocking him unconscious. The anonymous trans woman told Cron, I quickly ran over to him in an attempt to help Jared out, but was then punched in the face by the assailant and in the orange shorts. So if you do see photos of this, it's the guy in the orange shorts. The men then shoved another of the women on the ground and left the scene soon after, according to video footage of the incident. So, basically, to my previous point, community building. We can see this here, Mr. Jared, whoever he is an ally. That is allyship right there. Right there. It's not just posting on Instagram about how you care about trans lives. It's not just I'm looking at you, giant corporations, Target and everything. It's not just changing your company logo to rainbow during Pride. No, it is coming out and supporting and helping out fellow queer and trans people as they are being literally assaulted by random strangers who had no business even talking to these women. No business. And the fact is that if Jared had not stepped in, this trans woman probably would have been even more brutally assaulted by these people. And I'm not trying to make any assumptions here, but let's be real. These people were choosing to be violent towards her for a reason, and it is because they are transphobic. And this was, in fact, a hate crime. I don't care what the police say. The police can say anything they want because they do. This is a hate crime. This is hate crime behavior. And when I say being in community, I mean looking at not only the intersections of humanity, but seeing how we can support each other. And the fact is that you're not always going to agree with everybody. You're not always going to like everybody. But people like Jared here came out and supported a trans woman during a moment in which, frankly, her life was being threatened. And this happens to trans women everywhere. I'm kind of going off the cuff here for a second. I do not have this written down in my outline. But I recently moved about a year ago from Denver, Colorado. And recently a trans woman was murdered in Colorado. Her name is Jax, I believe. And she was missing for 12 weeks and then found in an alley. And I just want to talk about this because it is so important to discuss how our transgender comrades are being targeted, just outright targeted. This is that I know in my heart of hearts, being part of the queer community, that there is a very, very good chance that Jax was targeted for being a trans woman. And it breaks my heart, frankly, to see someone in a city that I love, that I grew up in for 6 years, be so brutally assaulted, and another trans woman in Texas also being brutally assaulted for the simple quote-unquote crime to these people, to transphobes, of being trans. And this is ultimately about having solidarity. When we talk about hate crimes that happen, it's really important to understand that having solidarity with those who have been through this traumatic incidents like these means not centering your own voice, but centering those who have been affected, and understanding that healing is not linear. Comrades are not always going to do or say everything that you want them to do or say when it comes to the healing process from terrible things like this. But once again, solidarity means sitting with your fellow comrades as they not only deal with the fallout from these situations, but defending them when they are going through it actively. We need to stop allowing things like this to just happen and then reacting. It needs to be a community of care. Also means identifying when these threats are actively happening, and then coming to the aid of folks who need us most. This means, again, the ICE raids, coming to the aid and the help of those who are being targeted, who are being illegally detained and taken to God knows where, Alligator Alcatraz, or more aptly put, Alligator Auschwitz at this point. Let's be so real. We need, when it comes to building community, yeah, it does mean sticking your neck out for other people. It does mean putting yourself out there. It does mean that when push comes to shove, we're there. We're there for our comrades when bad stuff is going down. Because at this point, the police aren't gonna come out and help you. They'll be 3 hours late and shoot your damn dog. Sorry, shoot your darn dog. Like, let's be guys. We need to look at people like Jared coming in and supporting this woman and her friends as models to look at and say, first of all, thank you, Jared. And second, we should all be more like Jared. Jared did not start that fight. Jared stepped in to support a comrade who was being harassed. And I think that that is not only very admirable, but it is something that comrades need to look at and say, okay, first of all, don't put yourself in dangerous situations. Don't put yourself in dangerous situations. But at the same time, when you are in community with people, and again, you're going to have all kinds of comrades. You know, we don't discriminate when it comes to not only the movement, but also community support and solidarity. People are going to be going and starting at different places, and having solidarity means understanding that trans people, people of color, queer people, disabled people, anyone who does not fit into the very tight norm or the very tight mold of what you were supposed to be, which is just a cisgender straight white man, you're gonna come up with against conflict. And that means that we all need to rally up behind and support people, because that is how we make true community change. That is how we build solidarity. And that is how we get movements like this off the ground and really make a difference and shake it up a little bit. Okay, so it is 7:30. You may have noticed, Comrade, you are not playing the mid-hour song. And I say to you, I know, Comrade, I am about to play you guys the first 24 minutes of my interview with one Grover Furr. He is an academic over at a university in New Jersey and is very accomplished in his work and writing on Stalin and the Soviet Union and really debunking a lot of, you know, crap and lies that are told about Stalin and the Soviet Union. And I am super excited to share this with you guys. First, I'm going to do a little preface. I'm going to read a little thing that I wrote about Mr. Stalin Man, and then we will go ahead and get started. And again, this is just the first 24 minutes. This is an hour and 11-minute long interview that I did with Mr. Furr, and so that will be available on YouTube when this episode of the Liberation Hour is aired. It'll be a little longer than usual, so definitely check it out if you're interested in learning more. And let me go ahead and get into this introduction. So when it comes to the second leader of the Soviet Union and so-called ruthless dictator Joseph Stalin, who was one of the biggest figures in the 20th century politics and world leadership, there's a lot of misinformation about the man. Truthfully, most of these stories, if not all, are completely made up and come from a breadth of bad faith research and fabrications coming out of so-called academics and whose anti-communist beliefs not only informed their own hatred for Stalin, but everyone else's too. This evening, you will be listening to an interview I conducted with one Grover Furr, a medieval English literature academic and committed researcher of Soviet-era and specifically Stalin-era history and archival resources. Furr has spent the better part of 50 years researching Soviet history and debunking rumors and outright lies made about Stalin meant to smear his image and what he stood for. And so, ladies and gents and NBs, let me play you the first 24 minutes of my interview with Grover Furr.
So, my first question for you is what are some of the most important and common misconceptions about Stalin here in the Western world?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, let me just click on this thing here. Uh, the In the last 60 or 70 years since his death, I would
Mm-hmm.
say Stalin has pretty universally been described as a kind of mass murderer, a monster, a dictator, and uh, and so uh, there are these numbers floating around. Some people say he killed 50 million people. Some people say more than that. Some people say, a few million fewer than that. Nevertheless, um, this is what has been floating around uh, in the West generally. And, we can talk about why that is, but, your question was, uh, what's the perception of Stalin? And the perception of Stalin among people who will admit to you, if you ask them, that they really have never studied or looked carefully into the question, is as I've described, a bloodthirsty dictator who ruled by terror. Um, and this has been reinforced, of course, uh, by governments in pretty much all of the capitalist countries. So it's all that most people ever hear, and propaganda works.
Oh, it does. Yes, it
So
does.
therefore, people tend to accept it because they really don't have any alternative.
Yeah, and I guess you did mention, why, can you briefly explain like why is this explain
Sure.
like
Well,
why do people believe
sure,
this?
sure. Well, I think you need to go back to the beginning. Um, the professional field of Soviet studies originated about the time of the Russian Revolution. Before that, there were Russian studies, um, which were basically, sympathetic to Russia. Russia the Russian Empire was an ally in the First World War, so it got some good publicity. But once the revolution started, once the revolution happened, the publicity in the West, the propaganda in the West was extremely negative. There was
Mm.
there was a Red Scare in 1918, 1919, 1920 in the United States, where the government rounded up and deported uh, basically all of the trade union activists and militants that they could find who had not been born in the United States. There was a real sort of a reign of uh, of terror and fear um, against people who sympathized with or who might sympathize with the Russian Revolution. And the reason for this is clear from documentation. Uh, the United States and the other Western European uh, uh, imperialist countries feared a revolution in their own countries. And even if they were not, uh, if they were not too fearful that an actual revolution would take place, they really were opposed to the existence and the growth of a militant working class movement. This is clear from the primary documents that have been made available, in the last few decades, that the governments in all of the industrialized countries were very much afraid, A, that there might be a revolution, and B, if there wasn't a revolution, then they would end up with a very militant, very powerful uh, working class movements, and of course that would cut drastically into the profits of their employers. It would change the balance of power in politics. So that accounts for the hostility in the West, and in fact in all the major industrial imperialist countries uh, against the Russian Revolution, and this continued. Um, so it continued up into the 30s, and of course after World War II, when the Soviet Union emerged as one of the two superpowers in the world, it increased. So the hatred and fear of the Soviet Union and the international communist movement was not based on uh, on any kind of moral grounds that somehow these people were cruel or they were mass murderers, anything like that. It was just based on the natural hostility of capitalists to a militant working class, and the fear of revolution was very sincere. It accounts for it accounts for the outbreak of World War II, which is a question we can get into, or perhaps for another time if you prefer.
Yeah, when you say like an outbreak of World War II, are you talking about like America's interests against the Soviet Union or the fact that the
Sure.
Soviets were beating the Germans?
Well, okay. Before I've completed a book on the period uh, in the 1930s up to the outbreak of the Second World War. Now, I won't be published for another year uh,
Right.
because I have another book coming along this year.
Look at
But
you.
yeah, well, yeah, but I did a lot of primary source research for this book on the run up to World War II. Um, the reason World War II took place, of course, in the first place, is because of Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler's plan to build a huge colonial empire in Europe, in Eastern Europe, okay, at the expense of the Soviet Union and Poland, particularly. But of course, uh, Hitler was uh, very worried about, very concerned that he might be opposed by uh, the Western capitalist countries. But the rulers, the elites in the Western capitalist countries, and particularly uh, uh, Great Britain, United Kingdom, France, and Poland, but also in the other major capitalist countries in Europe and in the United States. These elites uh, were were so hostile to the uh, to the international communist movement and therefore to the Soviet Union, which was the headquarters of the international communist movement. They were so fearful of this movement, they hated it so much that they refused um, to build uh, an alliance that, in the language of the time, was called collective security. They refused to build an alliance against Nazi Germany.
As per usual, the liberals do
Yeah,
not
yeah, they
want
refused
to
to do
side with
that.
communists.
Yes, they refused to do that very explicitly because they preferred, they didn't like Hitler. I mean, some of them liked Hitler, but many of them did
Henry
not like
Ford.
Hitler. But it was a question for them of the lesser of two evils. And
And to them, the lesser was the fascists,
then the lesser
apparently.
was the Nazis. As long as the Nazis were moving, as long as Hitler was moving to the east, and therefore ultimately against the Soviet Union, uh, they were happy with that. And it it's been clear for a long time that that's the case. But in the last couple of decades, many of the primary sources of the diplomacy of the Western countries has been published, and it's very clear from these primary sources that this was the case. That as long as Hitler was moving towards uh, attacking the communists, attacking the Soviet Union, they were willing uh, to let him do it, and they were even willing to let him conquer Poland because uh, they the Western countries, France and Great Britain, had a defense treaty with Poland after August 1939, but they knew when they made that treaty that there was no way they could come to Poland's aid if Germany attacked, and of course they didn't. So that
Yeah.
was really
And
the reason. That was the reason. That was the reason for the outbreak of World War II. So Hitler could have been stopped uh, any time in the 1930s if the Western capitalist countries had decided to do that, but they decided to do the opposite. They decided to let Germany rearm, uh, and in violation of the Versailles Treaty, which was signed after World War One, and so the World War II was the inevitable outcome.
yeah, and I find it really interesting that there's this narrative that America and the Western world was the ones that beat the Germans and
Sure.
Hitler, and were the anti-fascists, when in fact they clearly did not care about the anti-Semitism and the Holocaust that was befalling the Jews.
Yeah.
They specifically only cared about, okay, well, as long as you don't come after us, we aren't really going to do much about you. And in fact, I was reading a book called The Black Shirts and the Reds, which I'm sure you're familiar
Oh,
with,
sure. Mhm.
in discussion about the fact that capitalists in the West were actually perfectly fine with supporting Hitler. They were perfectly
Many of them
fine,
were. Yes, many of them
Henry
were. There
Ford
were
being a
some,
huge one.
yeah, many of them were. That's a great book by Michael Parenti, um, Black Shirts and Reds. Uh, Many of them were happy with Hitler. Uh, some of them weren't so happy, and it was a question of the lesser of two evils. And then there were a few who didn't really come to the fore. I'm thinking primarily of Winston Churchill, who didn't really come to the fore until quite late in the game, who were still very anti-communist, but
And
some
were very
really,
pro-colonial. They were very
yeah, oh yeah, they were
pro-colonial.
all they were all murderous imperialists for sure. But but Winston Churchill, who was in the government, um, Lloyd George, who had been the prime minister and was kind of a senior political figure in England, realized that the greatest danger to England and to the British Empire came from Hitler. And the only way to stop Hitler, England could not do it by itself, obviously, was to ally with the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, they didn't really do that, for some time. But there were some figures. We should be, clear about this. There were some figures in the elites of the West who who saw Hitler as the more immediate threat, and then the Soviet Union as a sort of longer range threat. Now, Churchill, who of course was part of the Great Alliance, right? Roosevelt,
Hmm.
Churchill, and Stalin. Churchill, talked a great line and certainly realized that it was necessary for the Allies to join with the Soviet Union to defeat Nazi Germany. But the war in Europe was not over more than a month before Hitler had his government draft the plan, which is known as Operation Unthinkable, uh, which is a plan to rearm the German army and to get all of the Allied armies together to attack the Soviet Union immediately. Now, they never put that into effect. They were not. I think they realized. We don't know all the details, but I think they realized this. The populations of their countries would not tolerate this.
Right.
But they certainly knew there was certainly their hostility to the Soviet Union uh, uh, came back to the fore once Germany was defeated.
Right. And so, kind of pivoting when you talked about like the Great Alliance with Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt,
Yes.
specifically talking about Stalin, what were some of the most important things which Stalin did while in power during the time of,
Sure. Well,
the Soviet Union?
sure. Well, one thing I want to just mention too, which is that there's this notion going around, which is if you're in the field of Soviet studies, you have to sort of pay obeisance to it, that Stalin was a dictator. Stalin was not a dictator. He was certainly the first among equals. Um, the other leaders of the Soviet Union paid a lot of attention to what he said and to his judgment and so forth. But there were a number of cases during his period when he was essentially in the lead of the Soviet Union, where he did not achieve, he was not able to uh, affect the policies that he wanted to do. So the idea that Stalin was a dictator is thoroughly ingrained in the vision of 20th century history that we're taught. The professional historians simply use that term without trying to defend it. But Stalin was not a dictator. He was, however, a, a capable leader. Not saying he didn't make any serious mistakes, but he was certainly a capable leader. And so the greatest things that he did, I think the collectivization of agriculture and the crash industrialization movement, both of which basically took place in let's say the first half of the 1930s. Industrialization, of course, continued, uh, and that changed the Soviet Union from being a basically poor agricultural country, which was uh, not militarily or economically powerful at all by the late 1920s, into a major power by the outbreak of World War II, capable of, at great cost, capable of defeating the German army, which was, of course, the most powerful army that had ever existed in the world up to that time. So that was a tremendous achievement, and was recognized as such all over the world, and is still recognized as such by, say, in many countries which were part of one colonial empire or another. Um,
Right.
and
And
so,
yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, that's it. I think those are the two major achievements. Now, there were others. They rested uh, on the empowerment of working people, peasants and workers. Uh, they didn't achieve communism in the, you know, in the fully realized form, but they did give a lot of power to workers and peasants, and that also resonated with common people around the world. It was recognized uh, that capitalism was not the only system that could um, around which a powerful country could be organized, could be run.
Yeah, and when I was reading up about Stalin before this interview, and also just in my own interest of him,
Sure.
I like to view him more as like an organizer because
Yeah.
that's what he started as, and that's what he was
Mhm.
to the party for many years prior to the death of Lenin and
Exactly.
Stalin's
Yeah.
takeover. He was over there going to all of these different Soviets and all of these different areas trying to basically like working out issues. I mean, he was one of the big organizers
Yeah.
when the October Revolution even happened.
Yes.
So would you agree with that, or would you what's your take, I guess, on Stalin as an organizer?
Yeah. Well, Stalin spent um, his youth, after his mid-teens, let's say, sometime as a political organizer, as an organizer of the Bolshevik Party in Georgia, in the Caucasus area, and was very effective and uh, very dedicated. Um, this is what ultimately brought him to the attention of Vladimir Lenin, who was the leader of the Bolshevik Party living in exile. And it also got him um, exiled in prison, so to speak, to Siberia on a couple of occasions. So he was not the only dedicated um,
Oh no, there
Bolshevik
were so many.
revolutionary. There were others, but he certainly was one of them. And then he was very active. He was active in uh, the run up to the Russian Revolution between February 1917 and October 1917. And then he was active uh, in the military during the Civil War, which took place for about 4 years the after the revolution, up until about 1921. So he was very active during that period too. And but he had been a political organizer, and I think that he was not one of the cadre of Bolsheviks who had been in exile, like Lenin, for example. But many of the other Bolshevik leaders lived in exile and did not, go through the difficult trials that he went through. So he had a political base among workers. He wasn't the only one who did, but he certainly
No.
was recognized as an organizer of workers, and he was from a working class family. Many of the Bolshevik leaders, not all, but many of them were from uh, middle class families, intellectuals, whatever. Stalin was from a working class family, and I think he had you know, a strong dedication to empowering working people and to following whatever guidelines he could glean from Lenin and Lenin's writings.
Yeah, and there's this like false narrative that he somehow grabbed power from Lenin, or there's also a story out there floating around that he killed Lenin for the position, and that's
Sure.
just so not true. Him
That's
and Lenin
right.
were actually, I believe, very close
Yes.
during
I wrote,
Lenin's rule.
I wrote a book about the fraud of the Testament of Lenin based on the research of a Russian uh, historian, Valentin Sakharov, who in the 1990s, because he was a full professor at a prestigious Russian university, got access for a time to the primary documents in the Lenin archive, which are basically still closed to researchers. But he got access, and he made some copies, he made some photographs, and he demonstrated to my satisfaction and to the satisfaction of others, not of everybody, but of some others, that the essays that that are purport to be by Lenin, published, written from December 1922 through March 1923, in which Lenin supposedly attacked Stalin, are not genuine. And I was convinced by his argument, by his evidence. And then when Stephen Kotkin's biography of Lenin, of Stalin, the first volume of it, came out sometime about 10 years ago, I was surprised and interested to note that Kotkin, who is a super anti-communist, of course, Kotkin was also convinced by Sakharov's evidence. So I think that the story that Lenin and Stalin, had poor relations during the last few months of Lenin's life, happens not to be true. But I also don't want to exaggerate the importance of that because, I don't think it's helpful to make Lenin kind of the litmus test of whether
Right.
somebody is a good Bolshevik, an effective leader, and so forth. Uh, uh, but it looks like to me and to some others that this this period of cool and perhaps even hostile relations between Lenin and Stalin did not, in fact, take place.
Yeah. And I guess this kind of, for some historical context, I think it's important. I want to talk about, what were the events of the famine of 1932 to
Sure,
33, and
sure,
how can we apply that knowledge to Stalin's policies of the time? We also talked
sure,
about the Ukrainian famine, and that may have
sure,
been like, and
sure.
there's a lot of misinformation floating around out
Right.
there. So, yeah.
Okay. So let me just say that for those who are interested in this question, um, you can get started on it, on looking into it, by reading two chapters in my book, Blood Lies, which was published in 2014, and the first chapter in my book, Stalin Waiting for the Truth, which was published in 2018, I think, something like that. And in those chapters, two chapters in the first book, one chapter in the second book, I summarize and footnote the studies by Mark Tauger. Mark Tauger recently retired as a professor of Russian history at the West Virginia University, but he spent his entire um, academic career from the time he was a graduate student until his retirement, and in fact, he is still researching on the topic of Russian agriculture, including Soviet agriculture. And he alone, among all of those that I have read, has gone back to the primary sources. And he shows, with a great deal of evidence, that the famine of 1932-33 was caused not by collectivization, and certainly not by the Bolsheviks or by Stalin, but by natural disasters. And I don't want to summarize what they all are. I do want to mention that I believe Tauger is the only researcher into this topic who has discussed the fact that there were 4 famines in the 1920s alone, preceding the 1932-33 famine, which is the one we're talking about now. And in fact, Tauger discusses the fact that there were serious famines in Russia. That includes, of course, Ukraine as a part of Russia at the time. There were serious famines every so many years, every 3, 4, or 5 years, going back 1,000 years, going back as far as recorded history, as we have recorded history. The climatic conditions of Russia are very different from those of the United States and Canada, let's say, or Western Europe. They're much less um, they're much less suitable for successful agriculture on a large scale, and the organization of agriculture was still basically one of medieval strip farming, with hardly any mechanization or fertilization, farming done by very poor peasant families, and any crop failure of any size led to widespread starvation and hunger. So this
So the system was already having trouble, as it were.
Oh yeah, no, it had terrible trouble. 4 famines during the 1920s alone. That's something you never read except in Tauger's research. And the reason you don't read it is because once you realize that, you realize that all of this story of, the Stalin and the Bolsheviks are responsible for the famine of 32, 33, and so forth, is just false. Tauger shows that because of these famines in the 1920s, Stalin and the Stalin leadership sent agronomists, agricultural experts, to the United States to study how large-scale farming was done in certain large, heavily mechanized Midwestern farms. That became the model that the Soviets wanted to follow. Now, of course, they couldn't follow it completely because the climatic conditions are somewhat different, and because they had to build a farm machinery industry from scratch. Yeah, they imported some tractors from the United States, but they couldn't buy enough tractors. Uh, so, so the plan to collectivize agriculture was accompanied by a plan of industrializing, that is, mechanizing agriculture itself. And that's eventually what happened. It's important to note that as a result of collectivization and industrialization and the mechanization of agriculture, the 1932-33 famine, which was a disastrous famine, was the last famine in the Soviet Union, except for the famine of 1946, which took place right after the war. There's some good research on that to show that it was also caused by climatic conditions. But except for that famine, the Soviet Union never had another famine. Industrialization uh, 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 of the Soviet economy permitted the Soviet Union after 1932-33 to um, to buy on the world market grain and agricultural products whenever there was a bad harvest in the Soviet Union, so that starvation did not take place. Now,
Yeah.
during the czars, um, the czar's government, according to Tauger's research, did little to buy grain abroad, um, and so the peasants simply starved, and
Yeah.
that was the alternative because of this very primitive form of agricultural production. Medieval strip farmings, many peasants farming with wooden plows, not even sometimes having draft animals. Um, it was There was no way that the Soviet Union could build socialism or could even think about building socialism, much less or industrialize or defend itself against invasion with that form of agriculture in place. So
Yeah, it made no sense for
they,
that. And
they couldn't do it.
I also did read on some primary sources and people who had gone back saying that if anything, it was more of a mass rationing in a lot of ways because of the
Okay.
fact that there was also a lot of clerical errors in 1932, which the Soviet Union, the government didn't even know that there was a problem with the agriculture until the snow had already fallen.
Right.
And so they had to basically implement a mass rationing campaign
Oh yeah.
until the next season when they did have a good harvest.
Yes. I mean, it sounds like you have either read some of what I summarized from Talger's research, or maybe read Talger's research itself. But that, as I recall, it's a few years since I've written about that, but that's basically correct. And so the story of the deliberate famine, supposedly caused by Stalin and or the Bolsheviks, goes back to German Nazi writers of the period 1933, 34, and was picked up by the Ukrainian nationalist movement. These were these were people who joined up with the Nazis and invaded the Soviet Union with the Nazis, and then fled to Western European countries and to the United States and to the Western Hemisphere, and came up with this notion of the Holodomor, the deliberate famine, which is a complete fraud. It simply there's no evidence for any of it. It never occurred, but it made great anti-communist propaganda and continues to do so. And the Ukrainian nationalists have been successful in sort of leapfrogging over academia, where no prominent academics believe that there was any kind of deliberate famine. No matter what else they may say, they don't agree with that. But they've left the Ukrainian nationalists have gotten this into the semi-popular and popular press and convinced a lot of people that
Yeah,
there
they
was
were.
a deliberate famine.
Well, there was already, as you said, like a priming to be against communism. And so
Oh,
whatever narrative was going to come out
sure,
was
sure,
going to be used, which
sure, and
makes sense in the context of how things were.
sure. And in Ukraine, after Ukrainian independence, 1991, the Ukrainian nationalists flooded back into the country, have had a tremendous impact on the educational system on all levels, and it's essentially illegal to question the story, the false story of the Holodomor in Ukraine today.
Interesting. I had no idea about that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
and I know that there's been a lot of problems with Nazis popping up in the Ukrainian army and in the Ukrainian government as well.
yeah, no, the Ukrainian nationalists have had great success in becoming prominent and very influential in post-Soviet Ukraine. And certainly the current war with Russia would never have happened if the Ukrainian nationalists had not been so, because of course they're also fanatically anti-Russia, and they're expansionist. So this would never have happened if the Ukrainian nationalists had not been so influential in Ukrainian politics and other aspects of Ukrainian society. So Ukraine, the citizens of Ukraine, have paid very dearly for the influence, this malign influence of Ukrainian nationalists in the construction of an anti-communist Ukrainian nationalism, patriotism.
Hmm. And that honestly, it makes me think about like American propaganda as well, and the fact that we
Sure,
are so anti-communist in this country
sure,
because of these that
sure.
obviously propaganda. And I wanted to ask, in the context of the American prison system today, which is notoriously uh, terrible, slavery is legal in our prison system. And I wanted to ask, what were the conditions of the Gulag like, and what were their purposes, and why did they exist? I think there's a lot of misinformation around that as well,
Sure,
and I would like to
yeah,
understand it more.
there is. The term Gulag actually meant uh, the institution of the penal system, but the term is often used just to mean the penal system itself. Okay, uh, go to the Gulag means go to a labor camp or maybe a prison. Okay, so I think uh, I think the best thing to do is to start by thinking of the Soviet Union in the early 1920s. The Soviet Union, Russia had been involved in the First World War. And it was a disaster from the point of view of the Russian army and the Russian soldiers. Millions of them were killed. The Russian army was not well trained. It was not well equipped. It was not well armed. And the war by the last year or two of the war had become extremely unpopular among the population. It caused tremendous death and tremendous suffering among the population in Russia. So that when the February Revolution, February 1917 was when the Tsar abdicated and a group of bourgeois capitalists, basically, and intellectuals became the government of Russia. This happened because the Tsarist regime was so unpopular, even among these elites, and that, of course, also greased the skids, so to speak, for the Bolsheviks to organize the Revolution of October. Then followed the Civil War. The Civil War, which was fought for 4 years within the boundaries of the new Soviet Union, was extremely bloody and was racked with atrocities, mainly atrocities committed by the anti-communist forces. The forces that were called the Whites were fighting for the return of the Tsar, at least that's what they said. And according to the American general who commanded the American forces that were sent to, in a kind of half-hearted move, to help overthrow the Bolsheviks, not successfully,
And it didn't work, yeah.
No, according to that general, it was the Whites who committed by the lion's share, I think he said 90%, but something like that, of the atrocities. But there were tremendous atrocities. There's tremendous violence, and civil wars are particularly bitter. If you've ever read anything about the American Civil War, you realize that in the border states, particularly, Kansas, Missouri, places like that, there was tremendous hostility and bitterness, neighbors killing neighbors, stuff like this, settling old scores. John Brown was involved in that, right? John Brown tried to drive the slavers out of Kansas.
American hero.
Yeah, well, he was, yeah, but I mean, he was part of this Civil War aspect of it, right? He was a regular. He had his own group of anti-slavery terrorists, so to speak, to attack the pro-slavery terrorists. Anyway, so this was an incredibly violent situation, and of course, meanwhile, the rest of the country is suffering a typhus epidemic. There's widespread starvation. So the Soviet Union Russia and the Soviet Union experienced these years of a tremendous degree of violence and suffering. And then and all of the fallout from that. So it was a very violent society. So the prison system, the judicial system, was set up to have to deal with this situation. And there were some years in the 20s when things calmed down a bit, but when the collectivization movement started in the around 1929, 1930, a lot of this bitterness and anger broke out again, especially in the countryside, where people had been divided. Now it was division between the poor peasants and the rich peasants and the middle peasants. There was a tremendous amount of violence, tremendous in comparison to what had gone before, and tremendous in comparison to any Western European country. So the Gulag was set up as a set of prisons and mainly labor camps as a correctional system. Now, I wrote a little bit about this in one of my articles a couple of years ago, that the correctional system, the labor camps, yes, people had to work, but they had recreational and educational facilities as well. very often they had bands and chess clubs and so forth. Obviously, the standard of living was not high by Western standards, although Western standards in Western prisons, but did not have a very high.
Yeah, I would argue that it doesn't really matter by
No,
Western standards because Western prisons are basically like
yeah,
concentration camps.
yeah,
So,
and during the 1930s, something I haven't seen discussed in relation with the Gulag, but somebody should do it, I think. Uh, During the 1930s, there was a big scandal in the United States about chain gangs, the chain gang system of imprisoning people, mainly black prisoners, but not entirely black prisoners, and then renting them as labor to contractors, to private companies, and so forth. A tremendous abuse of and of course, racist as hell. Uh, the the British and the French had terrible prisons. France had the Devil's Island off the coast of South America. Uh, Western prisons were not good, and they were largely not corrective. The Soviet prison system was set up as a correctional system, and many prisoners were released. There was a During the famine of 32, 33, there was a large mortality in the Gulag among prisoners, as there was in the rest of Russia, and of course in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. And then again, when Nikolai Yezhov became the head of the NKVD and the prisons were under his direction, under the commissariat, as it was then, of internal affairs, Yezhov used the prisons to uh, make people bitter, to recruit conspirators from. He talked about this in his confessions. And then again, and once he was overthrown, the conditions got better. And then again, during World War II, particularly in 42 and 43, there was a tremendous mortality in the Gulag, over 20% per year of the prisoners dying. However, at the same time, in the forget about the army, just in the rest of the Soviet Union, there was also tremendous malnutrition. All of the food was being sent to the troops at the front. Workers were dying literally in the factories from malnutrition, from starvation, literally on the factory floors. There's lots of documentation about that now. So I think you need to put the mortality in the Gulag into the context of the situation of the Soviet Union at this period of time, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, rather than directly comparing it, let's say, to the prison systems in the United States or Great Britain or France or something like that.
right.
Although they had, of course, very brutal conditions in their colonial possessions.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that like I don't support the Soviet Union and their like willingness to allow workers to die on, the floors of factories. Not more like willingness, but more just the fact that it happened. But when
Yes.
you look at the context, as you said, and you also look at what was happening in other countries around the same time, we
Yeah.
also allowed like child labor,
Oh, yeah.
and we were fine with that for many, many years.
Sure.
And so I think that it's important when we are criticizing the
Sure.
Soviet Union to
Sure.
look at it in the context, like you said,
Sure.
because there is more to
Sure.
understand than just the narrative which we are given.
Yeah, I have a quotation in one of my articles that I took from the works of Wendy Goldman and Donald Filzer. Now, Wendy Goldman is a professor of Russian and Soviet history at Carnegie Mellon University. Donald Filzer is retired. I don't recall right offhand which university he's retired from, but he spent his professional career as a historian of the Soviet Union, concentrating on the Soviet working class. They have a book and some essays on the conditions of Soviet workers, particularly during World War II. And I have a quotation from one of them in one of my articles, where they conclude that the Soviet Union simply did not have enough food to support this huge army that they needed and to give an adequate standard of an adequate nutrition to the entire population. And they say, and they're not pro-communist people, they say that this would have been the case. There would have been this degree of malnutrition and starvation, no matter what regime governed the country. If it was a Trotskyist regime, if it was a capitalist regime, or a Bolshevik regime, those were the objective conditions. And
This is just how it was going to be
this is
because
just
of
how
the
it was going to,
resources.
yeah. And between and as an aside, and I don't believe they say this, but I think you can deduce it from the situation. Anyway, the Soviet Union, as I mentioned earlier, had famines, had bad harvests every few years from natural causes. It did not happen in the period 1941 to 45. There were no such devastating, poor harvests. Now the Nazis took lots of the food and made sure that peasants starved and so forth and so on, but there weren't crop failures. The word in Russian is "не урожай," in other words, non-harvests. That's the word they use for them, crop failures. There was one in 46, but it was certainly fortunate. I mean, among all of this not malfortune, it was certainly fortunate that there was not a major crop failure on top of everything else during the war itself. But
And this
conditions
was
were bad.
under the rule of Stalin or under his
Yeah, it was during that time, yes, and there was malnutrition was rampant in the Soviet population during World War II. Okay, because everything was being prioritized to ship to the soldiers at the front to fight the war. That's the conclusion of Filzer and Oxman, and I think they are about as objective as you can get
and
on the conditions of the working class in the Soviet Union.
and it's important to understand this, especially when we are putting it in the context of the fact that farming in that area just was not as it was not giving as much as the people needed anyway, and so it was already a problem. It wasn't
And the
like
Germans,
the communists started this.
and the Germans were taking it. There's a reasonably good. I mean, I've never done any profound research on this particular question, but there's a reasonably good Wikipedia article called Hunger Plan, which was the German plan to starve the Soviet population during the war in order to prioritize feeding the German army and German citizens. Okay, most of whom, of course, were in Germany, but some had settled in Poland, and so there was a plan. There was well organized. The Nazis were certainly very good at organizing things to organize starvation during the war. And as I say, I haven't done specific research on the German hunger plan, but there's a good Wikipedia article on it. I haven't read the German article; it's probably even better. But certainly the English Wikipedia article makes it very, very clear. And after the war, the Allies went after the German officers who had planned this, and the leader of the main figure committed suicide rather than wait around to be hanged. But the Germans
At the
made,
Nuremberg trials. Yeah.
yeah, he didn't wait around to be hanged. He hanged himself.
Yeah.
He knew what was coming down the line, but the Germans did all they could to exacerbate the starvation of Soviets, of Slavs in general, in order to redistribute the food to their own population, their own soldiers, and the German population back home. They realized that support for the war would shrink drastically. This is in Germany. If the German population started to started to starve because that had happened in 1918, okay, in Germany. And there were food riots and so forth in Germany in 1918, okay, which had a lot to do with Germany losing the First World War, or at least the German army believed it did. So that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and it's also important. I think that like you bringing that up is important to understanding the fact that like the communists once again did not organize famine to control the working population. There's a lot that goes into why the famines even happened. And
Yes.
it leads me into my last question here perfectly, actually, which is, where did the 100 million death figure come from and why is it largely attributed to Stalin and Lenin, but mainly Stalin, and the fact that it
Sure.
just is not true?
Sure. Well, okay. I mentioned earlier that the field of Soviet studies started out as right after the revolution, as uh, primarily to provide ammunition for anti-Soviet propaganda, and only secondarily to research and discover what was really going on in the Soviet Union or what had gone on, right? Its primary task was to provide anti-communist propaganda. And that remains true even today. The Soviet Union is long gone, but the Soviet historiography is mainly geared towards, uh, uh, let's say, delegitimizing to the extent possible the idea of, 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 of communism, of socialist revolution. And so in many respects, almost any falsehood can pass muster as long as it's anti-communist. During the period of that the Soviet Union was in existence, there were some good research, particularly up through the period of World War II. Not much, but there was some. Starting with the Cold War in the late 1940s, um, the hammer came down, so to speak. I was in touch some years ago with a gentleman who's since died, who was working with the Hoover Institution in Stanford, California, which today is the largest and most influential and best funded anti-communist research center in the world. And it was to that it was it was not too much different from that up into the 40s, but they did have some people on board who were very interested in the Soviet Union and very sympathetic to the Soviet Union. That all ended in the late 40s. And after that, um, anti-communist propaganda, uh, became uh, uh, the main uh, the main source of information or disinformation about the Soviet Union and the communist world generally. So uh, this 100 million figure was sort of plucked out of the air by people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and others uh, who not only didn't have the evidence, but lived in a context where um, dispelling falsehoods about the Soviet Union and the international communist movement was simply not tolerated. It was simply not acceptable.
I also heard that when he was writing the Black Book of Communism, or was it him or was it? I could be getting that wrong. But when during the writing of the Black Book of
Yeah,
Communism, that they made up, they just pulled numbers out of thin air to add to the
okay.
100 million number.
Sure. One of the things that got me started on doing research on the Soviet Union. Um, I don't want to go all the way back to the beginning, but uh, uh, in 1968, a man named Robert Conquest published a book called The Great Terror, Stalin's Purge of the 30s. It's like an 800-page book. It's a very large book. And in the early 1970s, well, in the mid 1970s, after I had a chance to get started on my academic career, worked on my PhD dissertation, I spent more than a year checking Conquest's footnotes because I knew from my own training in graduate school, I suspected that he didn't have any evidence for the horror stories that he tells in that book. And sure enough, Conquest had no evidence. Now, he quoted his idea of establishing a fact was to quote some other writer who had made the same claim. All right, but as as a moment's thought will tell anybody, if Professor A makes a fact claim and Professor B footnotes Professor A, that doesn't make it true. Okay, that's not evidence. It's not evidence if it's just somebody making a statement. But
It's
for
not a
Conquest,
primary source.
yeah, that's right. On the other hand, and I'm not making excuses for Conquest, he was a horrible liar, but after 1956, after Khrushchev, uh, primary sources were simply not available to researchers, even to Soviet researchers. Okay, they couldn't get into the archives. They couldn't see the primary sources. And so basically anything went, right? And this continued to be the case. This was the case during Khrushchev, and it's continued to be the case all along. And then when Mikhail Gorbachev became the first secretary in 1985, he and his entourage among the Soviet leaders ginned up a campaign, an anti-Stalin campaign that ultimately surpassed even the anti-Stalin campaign of Nikita Khrushchev from 56 to 64. And Gorbachev's men churned out thousands of books and articles making these outrageous claims of horror stories about the Stalin years and about Stalin himself. It's only been since the end of the Soviet Union and really in a serious way since the late 90s or maybe even the year 2000 that we have begun to get lots of evidence from the former Soviet archives, lots of primary source evidence to show what really happened, what really occurred, to check the statements that were made by the anti-communist scholars for so many years. And that is really where I came in because in 1999, an amateur but very talented researcher in Russia, in Moscow, Vladimir Bobrov, contacted me. He liked one of the articles that I had published, managed to get published with some difficulty, and put on my webpage. And he introduced me to the fact that many of these primary source documents had begun to be published. And that is what I've been concentrating on for the last 25, 26 years. Okay. And that's what's made it possible to begin to understand what's true and what's false uh, in the historiography of the Soviet Union, and to dismantle with good evidence the horror stories about Stalin and the Gulag, the famine, and the so-called purges, these kinds of stories, which not only in the past but even today continue to pass as common knowledge among a great many people, and to a certain extent even among academics who really should know that.
Yeah, I think that it's really unfortunate that for so long we didn't have access to these primary sources, and so rampant anti-communists could just make up numbers out of the blue and say this happened, and there was no way that anyone could fact check that because we just didn't
Yeah.
have access to it. And
Yeah.
I've had my own arguments with family and friends over, my support of Stalin as a leader, and I say to them, well, if you look at the evidence, the actual evidence which exists, which you can go find yourself, which I think a lot of anti-communist scholars, when they put those footnotes in, they're not expecting anyone to actually go back and fact check them.
Yes.
Any random person who's going to read that book isn't most likely isn't going to take time out of their day as you had to go back and say, okay, is this actually factual or was this just made up? You
Yeah,
know?
yes, and a lot of these, most of these materials, of course, are in Russian, and it takes a certain amount of experience and skill, as well as the access to research libraries, to actually to get these documents, to obtain them, and to do the fact checking that I do, and that you just recommended that people do. It's not, most people can't do that, you
It's
know?
really difficult
No,
because if you
most
don't
people,
speak the language, yeah,
yeah.
as you, sorry, can,
So most people rely, understandably, because they have to, on the legitimated experts. Okay. And in the case of Soviet history, the history of the communist movement generally, but certainly in the case of the Soviet history, and particularly during the Stalin period, the legitimated experts either do not are not interested in the truth. They're interested in producing, anti-communist, anti-Stalin propaganda dressed up as scholarship, what I call is propaganda with footnotes, um, or they know that they can't really make a career in the field of Soviet history unless they uh, echo, they reproduce what I have called the anti-Stalin paradigm. Okay, you have
mm,
to be anti-Stalin. I've actually been told some years ago now by two different professors of Soviet studies who are good people who whom I was in touch with and who liked my research, but they both of them said, "Listen, Grover, you really have to say some bad stuff about Stalin. You can't just debunk and disprove the falsehoods that people have made, that academics have made about Stalin. You have to say something bad about Stalin or you'll never get published." And my
yeah,
response was, that was interesting. My response was, well, I'm not really writing for those people. I know what the professional field of Soviet studies, of Soviet history is all about. And I know about the anti-Stalin paradigm, that you have to you know, agree that Stalin was a very bad guy in various ways. Um, and I'm not really writing for those people. I'm writing for a different audience altogether. People who really do want to know the truth about Soviet history, and there are some of them around. I mentioned Mark Tauger, who is an expert on Soviet agriculture, Russian and Soviet agriculture. And there
hmm,
are a very small number of such people around. But in general, you can't have a career in the field of Russian and Soviet history unless you fit your research into the framework, the Procrustean bed, if you're familiar with that image, of the anti-Stalin paradigm. And I write about the anti-Stalin paradigm in some of my books.
yeah. And this has been such a great interview. I really appreciate
Well,
you
I
doing
appreciate
this.
the opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important. Like I am a communist, and I think that it's really important for people to understand the realities. And like again, we're not. I as someone who runs WRFU, not runs WRFU, runs the Liberation Hour on WRFU.
Okay.
I really like we pride ourselves, myself and my co-writers, the people who just help me write the show, on double checking sources and making
Great.
sure that what we're talking about is factual, and also not creating cult of personalities around people,
Right.
rather looking at the
Yes.
reality and saying, hey, Lenin was not a dictator, Stalin was not a dictator. Were they perfect people? No, because no perfect person exists.
Yeah.
But we
Yeah.
can see
Stalin
the
made,
fact.
yeah.
Oh, go ahead, go ahead.
Stalin, Lenin and Stalin made plenty of mistakes, but you see, they're not
Yeah,
described in general as making mistakes. They're described as being criminals.
they're described as the likes of Hitler. They're
Yeah.
described
That's
as people who are Hitlerian in their policy, and it's just not true. They were obviously, Stalin and the Red Army were some of the first people to have to actually fight against the fascists, and
yeah.
actually like because I think this fact goes very unknown to a lot of people, but
Yeah.
12 million Slavic people were murdered in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
You know, they
Sure.
wanted to kill Slavs,
Yes, that
and
was the plan. Yes, the
that was the
plan,
plan, and to
general
enslave the
plan,
Slavic. Go ahead.
Generalplan Ost, General Plan East was Hitler's plan for the uh, for the Slavic areas, and it was for killing 80% of the population and using the other 20% for labor, essentially. So
And the
it's
Nazis, yeah, and the Nazis, you know, I think a lot of bad faith liberals who don't actually want to have conversation about this say, oh, well, the Nazis were socialists. They were the socialist, and it's like that's just so untrue. You could literally just Google that. Like you
sure,
could just Google it and see it's
sure,
not true. That they
sure,
hated communists. That the communists were some of the
sure.
first that they sent to the camps
Yeah, the
because they
reason
realized they were their only actual
yeah,
opposition.
the reason that the party that Hitler joined in 1920 or 21, whenever he joined it, had already been formed, and it was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And the term of socialism and workers, they put that term into the party name because socialism and uh, and workers, the working class, were such popular slogans in Germany after the end of World War One that in order to recruit anybody to any party, you had to pretend to be for the workers and pretend to be for socialism. So that's
Yeah, I
why
mean,
the party was called the NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. But of course, Hitler had all of these uh, meetings with big businessmen and so forth. There's any number of books. There's an excellent one by Jacques Powell's, a Canadian author, but there are others called Big Business and Hitler. You know, Hitler was really in direct league with the German big business tycoons, and had nothing to do. He was
yeah.
the last
And
thing from socialism. Yes.
and I would go so far as to say that the reason he was even able to come to power is because of business tycoons who saw him as an opportunity, as well as Western tycoons who saw his rise and his colonial effort as
Yeah.
a reason, as a means to expand
Yeah.
capitalism.
Very good.
Um,
That's true.
and I think that it's just really important to understand that as Michael Prenti had talked about, I believe his name is Michael Prenti, in or Parenti. I don't know if his first name is Michael. I think I got that
Michael,
wrong.
yeah, he has a son named
Yeah.
Christian, but Black Shirts and
Okay.
Legends written by Michael Parent.
And he even said that the final stage of capitalism is just fascism
Yeah,
because that's how imperialism works as a mode to make this happen.
yeah,
And so this interview I think will be really informative to a lot of people to understand what the Soviet Union actually was and who Stalin was, rather than the propagandized belief that we've been given here in the West, which I don't think a lot of Westerners really see ourselves as propagandized. I think a lot of Westerners see ourselves as enlightened
yes.
in comparison to the third world, who we have very conveniently colonized. Um, and I think it's important to dispel that idea that we are somehow smarter or more informed when in fact we are just as propagandized, if not more,
Mhm.
than your average fascist country.
Good. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity
Yes.
to speak to you and to your listeners. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Yes, this will be airing on Wednesday, and I'm so excited to air this. Thank you so much.